The third process is sequence activities, which is the process of identifying and documenting relationships among the project activities. The key benefit of this process is that it involves the mapping of task dependencies, so you can determine the logical sequence of work to obtain the greatest efficiency given all project constraints. To do this, the project manager will require the preceding documents. The ITTOs for the sequence activities process are as follows. Here, you can see that the key inputs in this process are actually the outputs from the preceding process. Schedule Management Plan. Again, it identifies the scheduling method and tool to be used for the project, which will guide how the activities may be sequenced in this process. Activity List. The activity list from the prior process contains all schedule activities required on the project, which are to be sequenced. We need to consider dependencies and other constraints for these activities since that can influence the sequencing of activities. Activity Attributes may describe a necessary sequence of events or defined predecessor or successor relationships. And Milestone List. The list may have scheduled dates for specific milestones, which may influence the way activities are sequenced. The key tools and techniques we use in this process are Precedence Diagramming Method, or PDM. Before creating a project schedule, you need to identify and understand the dependencies between project activities. Each activity is dependent on some other activity. When a dependency is not identified, the project will be delayed until such a time that identification occurs. Let's take a look at an example here. Precedence diagrams are also known as project schedule network diagrams that represents activities through the use of boxes, referred to as nodes, and connects them with arrows that show the dependencies. Basically, activities are graphically linked by one or more logical relationships to show the sequence in which the activities are to be performed. Activity on node is one method of representing a precedence diagram. This is the method used by most project management software packages. In PDM, finish to start is the most commonly used type of precedence relationship, but it can be used to show other types of relationships as you see in this figure. Let's give dependencies a more in-depth look. Types of dependencies. There are 4 types of dependencies that you need to be aware of before creating a precedence diagram. Finish to start. In this dependency, activity B cannot start until activity A has ended. For example, you cannot cook a stew before gathering all the ingredients. Therefore, the activity, gather ingredients, needs to finish before the activity, cook stew, can begin. This is the most commonly used dependency. Start to start. In this dependency, there is a defined relationship between the start of activities. So, both tasks A start at the same time. For example, leveling concrete cannot begin until pouring the foundation begins. Finish to finish. In this dependency, there is a defined relationship between the end dates of activities. So, both tasks finish at the same time. For example, writing a document is required to finish before editing the document can finish. Start to finish. In this dependency, there is a defined relationship between the start of one activity and the end date of a successor activity. This dependency is rarely used. It means that the completion of one task depends on the start of a later task. For example, the first security guard shift cannot finish until the second security guard shift starts. Another tool and technique is dependency determination. Dependencies can either be mandatory or discretionary, internal or external, or a combination of each. For instance, mandatory external. Mandatory dependencies are often referred to as hard logic and are inherent in the nature of the work, such as physical limitations, or they may be due to contractual obligations. If you are working on building a new product, a prototype has to be built before it can be tested. In a project, the project team will need to determine which dependencies are mandatory during the process of sequencing the activities. Discretionary dependencies, often referred to as preferred logic, preferential logic, or soft logic, are typically due to industry best practices or a desired sequence. For example, you decide that it is best to make door and window frames before the full structure of the wall is in place. External dependencies involve a relationship between project activities and non-project activities. These dependencies are usually outside the project team's control, unlike internal dependencies. For example, you need to ensure that the electrical company has connected the electrical supply before the cables can be tested. Internal dependencies involve a precedence relationship between project activities and are generally inside the project team's control. For example, you know that drywalling a wall should be complete before the painting can start. Note that this is also an example of a mandatory dependency. It's important that the project management team determines which dependencies are internal during the process of sequencing the activities. And third in our list of tools and techniques, we have leads and lags. A lead is the amount of time whereby a successor activity can be advanced with respect to a predecessor activity. A lag is the amount of time whereby a successor activity will be delayed with respect to a predecessor activity. Let's look at this example here. The key output is project schedule network diagrams, which are graphical representations of the logical relationships, also referred to as dependencies, among the project schedule activities. Here you can see what this looks like. As you can see here, the schedule network diagram visually depicts how all the tasks in your schedule string together. While the WBS shows you how many tasks you have to accomplish, the schedule network diagram shows the order those tasks need to happen. It's a great way for starting to understand and visualize how your project will proceed. In the context of project planning, a network diagram is a sequence of steps or activities commonly represented by boxes. They are linked together in the logical sequence they need to be carried out. Once the diagram has been completed, you have a clear picture of the required sequence of events and activities for your project. For example, you cannot start building your house foundation until you have first prepared and leveled the ground. It's important to include the project team in the development of the network diagram so you can get a consensus of understanding of how the project should be implemented.